The meeting lasted exactly 4 minutes. I was still weak, barely over the flu that had flattened me for 5 miserable days, but I was determined to show my dedication. My boss, Mr. Harrison, sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face set in a look of controlled contempt. I had been a crucial member of his executive assistant team for 7 years at Titan Capital, a high-stakes private equity firm. I was Vivian, and I was loyal, efficient, and discreet. None of that mattered. Vivian, Mr. Seeming Eye. Harrison stated, not bothering with pleasantries, your performance this quarter has been unacceptable. The sick leave you took last week was disruptive to a critical client meeting. He pushed a severance agreement across the desk. We are letting you go, effective immediately. We need someone who can demonstrate absolute, uninterrupted commitment.
I stared at the papers, the blood draining from my face. I had been fired for taking sick leave, the first prolonged absence I'd taken in 3 years. The injustice of it was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I tried to argue to defend my 7 years of dedication, but he simply cut me off with a raised hand. Sign the agreement, collect your severance, and leave. Your access is already terminated. The shock was immediate, followed by a burning, helpless rage. I was discarded like a broken machine, my health treated as a moral failing. I walked out of the office in a daze, the cold steel of betrayal replacing the fever in my bones. I'm Vivian. I spent 7 years believing that hard work and loyalty were a shield against professional cruelty. I found out the hard way that they are merely currency to be spent and discarded.
What you are about to hear is the story of how my former boss's ruthless action led me directly to the key that could dismantle his entire empire. Before we delve into the investigation, please tell me where you are listening to this story from.
It helps me know who is ready for a story about true corporate reckoning. The professional damage was immediate.
Being fired from Titan Capital was a black mark on any resume.
Mr. Brissell, Harrison had effectively tried to destroy my career over 5 days of rest. The escalation began as I processed the injustice.
My initial anger quickly evolved into a quiet, focused resolve. I wouldn't just take the severance and leave. I would find a way to make him pay. The key to the whole operation, the ultimate micro-hook, was purely accidental.
As I was boxing up my final belongings, I found a small, unmarked USB drive tucked deep beneath a stack of old sticky notes in my desk drawer. It wasn't mine. Mr. Harrison must have misplaced it during one of his rare moments of tidiness. My gut told me not to ignore it. The sick, desperate part of me that craved justice told me to investigate. I took the drive home and with trembling hands plugged it into my laptop. It wasn't encrypted. It contained hundreds of files not labeled with client names but with dates and coded abbreviations. Most were complex financial ledgers and spreadsheets I didn't immediately understand. But one folder, simply labeled Jade, caught my attention. The Jade folder contained a series of financial statements for an entity I'd never heard of, Jade Holdings, LLC.
The statements showed massive, recurring payments from Titan Capital Payments that bypassed all the standard accounting and audit trails I knew. This wasn't just a corporate expense, this was a hidden financial artery. The paper trail was elaborate, clearly designed to confuse, but my experience as his assistant for 7 years gave me the context to recognize the players. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, and coded references that looked suspiciously like specific, non-public trading activities. My heart began to pound. This wasn't just tax evasion. The numbers, the speed of the transfers, and the deep concealment pointed to something far more sinister.
Mr. Harrison was using Jade Holdings to move hundreds of millions of dollars entirely outside of Titan Capital's regulated books.
This was the dark everyday horror I had stumbled upon. Not just a small ethical lapse, but massive, systematic financial fraud that could bring down the entire firm. My planning began immediately and in total secrecy. I hired a specialized forensic accountant, Miss Chen, an expert in tracing offshore funds. I didn't tell her who I was or where the drive came from. I simply presented her with the raw data, asking her to identify the criminal liability. Chen's initial report was damning. The transactions weren't just untaxed, they were highly illegal, involving insider trading and potentially money laundering on a massive scale. The Jade funds were being used to manipulate the stocks of companies Harrison was about to acquire,
guaranteeing him astronomical personal profits while robbing Titan Capital's investors.
The penalties for this type of scheme were life-altering, massive fines and long prison sentences. I now held the key to his downfall, given to me by the very man who had tried to destroy my livelihood. I was no longer the discarded assistant. I was the secret custodian of a corporate catastrophe. The sheer audacity of his crime and the fact that I held the digital evidence in my hand solidified my resolve. I would not use this for mere civil retribution. I would use it to end him, utterly and completely. I spent the next 2 months building my case, not for a severance lawsuit, but for a total corporate takedown. Ms. Chen and I meticulously mapped the flow of the JD funds, cross-referencing the coded entries with public trading data.
We discovered that Harrison's fraud was about to culminate in the biggest trade of his career, a leveraged acquisition that would net him an estimated $500 in illegal profit, scheduled to execute on the final business day of the month. The timing of the explosion had to be perfect. Just before he secured his $500 million payday, and just before the mandatory quarterly audit that would likely miss the highly complex concealed transactions. I chose the day before the acquisition was set to close. I had 2 critical actions to perform, designed to hit him simultaneously from the government and from within his own firm. My first move was to execute the ultimate, poetic justice. I didn't send the evidence to the press. I delivered the complete, verified package, the USB drive, Ms. Chen's expert analysis, and a detailed narrative of the fraud to the regional office of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I did this anonymously, using a secure Dropbox and a prepaid phone, ensuring my identity remained protected. The severity of the crime was so immense that I knew the SEC would act immediately. My second, more personal action was directed at the true foundation of his power, the investors. I knew his inner circle, and I knew their deep-seated paranoia about risk. I sent a simple, anonymous message to the 4 largest institutional investors in Titan Capital, the ones who could withdraw the capital that fueled his entire operation. The message read, "Conduct an immediate unscheduled internal audit specifically for transactions involving Jade Holdings, LLC. The liability is existential, and the evidence is now in the hands of the SEC." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The SEC opened a non-public high-priority investigation within hours. Simultaneously, the major institutional investors, terrified by the mention of the SEC and the unknown entity Jade Holdings, initiated emergency redemption requests, pulling billions of dollars from Titan Capital. The next morning, Mr. Harrison walked into his office, ready to execute his $500 million trade. Instead, he found chaos. The SEC had arrived, serving warrants, and seizing servers. His trading lines were frozen because the firm was facing a massive, irreversible liquidity crisis caused by the sudden withdrawal of investor capital. His partners were screaming about the run on the firm, and his chief legal officer was trying to stave off federal agents. The sight of him being escorted out of the building by federal agents later that afternoon, his face a mask of shock and defeat, was the ultimate emotional closure. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his money and power could bury any mistake. He thought firing his loyal assistant would be a minor inconvenience. Instead, he had handed her the very weapon that exposed his entire criminal enterprise. The media coverage was explosive. Titan Capital was shuttered, its assets frozen. The extent of the fraud was staggering, and Mr. Wire. Harrison was facing multiple criminal charges, including insider trading, securities fraud, and money laundering. His entire net worth was seized by the government to cover the penalties and investor losses.
He went from being a powerful, feared executive to a pariah facing decades in prison, all because he couldn't grant his employee 5 days of sick leave. I emerged from the scandal completely clean, protected by my anonymity and my lawyer's meticulous planning. I received a significant reward for my cooperation as an anonymous tipster. The money was nice, but the real reward was the justice. I used the reward money to start my own consulting firm, one that specializes in ethics and compliance for startups. A business built entirely on the principles Mr. Harrison had violated. I heard later, through a former colleague who was trying to get a job at my new firm, that Mr. Harrison had lost his house, his family, and his freedom. And that's when I realized the power of my unique vengeance. He fired me for a minor absence, and in return, I engineered his total, permanent absence from the financial world.